In this video, we are going to continue taking our HTML, CSS, JavaScript quiz game and bringing it over into the React world. We're specifically going to be diving into this quiz page. In the React application, we've just built out a couple of different routes and learned about some of the basic features of React. And now we're actually going to dive into this quiz page and bring over this logic where we display questions that the user can interact with one at a time. Before we do that, what we need to do is focus on planning. So the features that we're going to be building are more substantial than like our about page. So we want to think about the right way to approach them and get them mocked out on paper before we dive into code. When you do this process of planning out your architecture on paper, you can iterate on ideas much more quickly and arrive at better solutions than if you just open up your code editor and start coding blind. So we're primarily going to use three techniques to do this. We're going to do wireframing on the whiteboard. We are going to then take a screenshot and try to identify the components. And then we are going to make a responsibilities list to describe what each component should do. And those three things should help us in broad strokes map out the architecture of our application so that we can code it efficiently and in a modular way. So the first thing I want to do is wireframing. And if you haven't done wireframing before, there are different levels of fidelity you can do. We're going to do a really low fidelity wireframe. So with wireframing, the idea is give yourself a frame for what your page looks like, and then start filling in individual pages. And then we'll be able to string multiple together to show the flow of our quiz game by drawing individual pages back to back, kind of like comic book panels. So our application currently has like a nav bar at the top where it says home. Maybe it says play or quiz. Eventually we'll want to have like a create page where you can actually create a new quiz. We have about, we might have other things up in this nav bar. I'm going to stick with just home, play, create for the wireframe here. And if we're on the home page, it says home. And I'm using squiggles here to indicate that there's like some placeholder text here. The idea isn't for what we're doing. The idea is not to focus on high fidelity, but just like get the ideas out, see how the flow works so that we can use that to map out how to structure this. So eventually we'll want to think about that create page and how do we structure something so that we can have users create quizzes, save them under the account, share them with the rest of the world. But we're really just focused on the play. So we can add a little caption under this frame to say, user clicks on play. And then we draw a new page. What would happen here if the user actually clicked on play? And I'm going to use the placeholder text here for our nav bar up at the top. And then when they're on the quiz page, we had these 2 or 3 boxes at the top here for stats. So let's do 2 here. We had score and something like question number. Then some placeholder text here for the actual question. Then we had 4 possible answers that I'll throw on the page here as buttons with numbers in each of them. And one change we're going to make as we're porting over to this React structure is actually giving ourselves a next button down here that the user clicks on to advance to the next question. So the flow is going to be that we click on one of these buttons, we'll get some feedback on whether we were right or wrong, and then we'll click the next button to advance through the quiz. So I am going to go ahead and copy and paste this over here. There are better tools for wireframing. Microsoft Whiteboard isn't necessarily built for doing this type of thing. Figma is a good one, but I'm using this just so that we can like kind of stay loose and sketchy with our diagramming and not worry too much about fidelity. So here we can see user C's first question, picks answer, and let's draw a little mouse cursor here over to say that that's where they're clicking. When they click on that, we want to change the feedback here. So we want our button to turn red to indicate that that was the wrong answer, and we want our other buttons to turn kind of like a disabled color here. And we might as well sort of update our previous frame to have that next button be disabled until you click on one of these answers. Let's add a little mouse cursor here. User sees feedback plus clicks next. We're going to repeat this process for all the questions that we have, and then I can go ahead and give us a new frame. And this will be where we have our end screen after they have gone through all of the questions. So we'll still have our little stats here. We're at 10 of 10. And then maybe we'll have like a little graphic, like a trophy here. So we might display their score, their like all-time best score on this quiz, and then have a retry button. User sees final stats and can replay. So there we go. We have a rough mock of our game in a wireframe form. The key here is really not focusing on fidelity, but focusing on the big picture of our application. How does this work? Going from page to page, what are the kind of interactions that we would have? And once we've got this, we can go ahead and move over to design software like Figma or Sketch or XD and actually mock this up in higher fidelity. Having the mock, though, at this fidelity lets us start thinking about the state. Like, looking at this, we know we're going to have to track the score somewhere so that we can display it on the final page. And we probably have to track the high score. And we're going to need to be able to track when buttons have been clicked and what's the right and wrong answer to highlight these buttons in the right kind of feedback. So that's a good start. And then what I like to do after getting the wireframe is focusing in on a specific page and seeing if we can kind of dissect that page to figure out what components should be there. So maybe I will grab this page here, copy it, paste it down here. And let's switch markers to gray. So some of the stuff we already know, like up here, this is our page header that we've already created as a component. And we know that we also have like a footer at the bottom. That's the page footer. then all of this content that's in between the header and the footer, this is our quiz page, which we already have created as a mock component. So then zooming in on the quiz page, we can start thinking about the pieces here. Like this set of things we could put into a stats component that takes in the score and the current question and displays that stats information nicely formatted. And this chunk here could be a trivia item or trivia question component that is responsible for displaying the score, or responsible for displaying the question and creating these buttons on the page. Let's also grab the end screen. And we don't need this text. And if we look at these together, we can also see that, hey, we've got stats on this page too. So if we're going to put them on both pages, that's a good place where we want it to be a reusable component so that it's easy to put on both places. And then all of this could be in an end screen component. At this stage, I like to think in terms of broad strokes for the things that need to be reusable components. When we get into code, we'll actually break this down even further. Like if we look at our stats here, we have two things that we're putting on the page that have this structure where there's a label at the top and then some value in it. So actually, when we get into code, we'll have stats that is composed of individual stat components. So it's good to think in terms of broad strokes, and we'll kind of like modularize this as needed as we're working on the components. But it's useful to have the broad strokes before we start. So I think of what we did here. We've got our wireframe up at the top, and then we have taken key pages from our wireframe and done a dissection into components, at least in terms of broad strokes. And then the next thing that I would like to do in my planning process is think about what is the responsibility of each of these components. So actually, maybe I'll do these side by side here. So in programming in general, there's this idea of single responsibilities, that your components should do a single thing and do that thing really well. So if you're describing what a component does and you say "and" a whole lot of times, that's usually a signal that you need to chop that up. Like if we approached this, what we had here, and modeled it as one component, we would say, it controls the flow of the game, and it renders the stats, and it displays the trivia, and it displays the final end screen, where we've said "and" a whole bunch of times. So what we want to do is start thinking about our components and what their individual single responsibility is. So our game component is responsible for controlling the game flow. So that's going to be, I didn't even put it into this diagram. I should have done that. So this quiz game component is going to load a game component. Whoops, wrong color here. That is going to have our stats and our trivia item in it. So kind of our page is responsible for just giving us a route, maybe setting the title in the browser bar, And then our game component is going to have all of these child components in it. So it's like the manager or the orchestrator that is going to grab an individual trivia item and put it on the page and keep track of the score so that it can tell the stats component about it. So it's responsible for the game flow. And then our stats component is just responsible for rendering the game stats. So just the formatting, displaying it on the page, the score, and the current question. It doesn't do anything beyond that. Our trivia item. Display trivia question. And wait for an answer from the player. And then our end screen. Display final game stats. And at this point, it can also be helpful, in addition to doing this kind of dissecting, to actually write out some Jsx markup for what you think the page is going to look like. So we're going to have a quiz page component that inside of it has a game component. Inside of that is the stats and the trivia item. In this case, what's inside of the game is a little different on our one trivia question page versus our end screen kind of page. So this can be swapped with end screen as needed. And this isn't our whole picture of our application. We have our app component, we have the browser router. I'm just kind of focused on the components that we're building here and the components that we're interacting with. We have a structure like this, where our game orchestrates the flow, tells our stats component, what should you render, what question are we on, what's the score. It gives the current trivia data over to the trivia item to render to the screen. And that trivia item can then notify us when the player picks an answer. One more thing that I might add here too is it's great to think about the responsibilities and do this diagramming. It can also be helpful to think about where the state in your application lives. So in our quiz application, we have state for like the current score and the trivia index and our trivia data, the array of all of the questions. And we may also need to, when we need to know whether the game is currently running, whether we're in question mode or on the end screen. All of these things I'm going to say in our application are the responsibility of the game component to keep track of. These are all related to the game flow. And then we're going to have some more state here related to our flow going from this trivia question to this feedback stage. When the user has clicked on something, we need to track what they've clicked on. We need to update the feedback so that some buttons look disabled. And then the button that we've clicked on is either highlighted in red or green, whether you got it right or wrong. So our trivia item over here we're going to need to know if the user has selected an answer. If so, then we can start doing our formatting to mark things correct, incorrect, or disabled. And we're also going to need to know, what that selected answer actually was. and that we can use to sort of mark the feedback as well. So these, I'm going to say, are the responsibility of our trivia item. So we've got our wireframe, we've got our component diagram, responsibilities, and we've gone even further to map out our state. So we should be in a good place to start actually building this React quiz game. And as we build it, we will see how we're able to orchestrate all of these components together, because our game component is going to need to talk to the stats component, and our game component is going to need to talk to the trivia item. Trivia item and our end screen are both going to have to communicate something back to our game component. Like the end screen, when you click retry, it needs to talk to the game to say like, hey, time to restart. And the trivia item, when the user selects an answer, is going to have to tell that back, communicate that back to the game to say like, hey, did the player get it right or wrong, so that we can control the score. So we'll dig into those communication methods as we start building the components. So that's it for this video. I recommend using these 3 different strategies, like the primary ones of wireframing, dissecting the components, and thinking about responsibilities when you're building your own applications. They will help you sort of sort out the architecture before you get to coding. In the next video, we'll dive into actually building this in code.